When you're doing a YouTube channel that primarily has a focus on things that are on average 30 years old or older, there might be some concern about how to make these videos relatable to contemporary audiences. Now, personally, I don't care about silly little things like being relatable or trying to chase viewers or being successful. I mean, come on, who really cares about those things? Certainly not someone who's going to review a multi-platform game from a third-party developer that had a mediocre reputation at best, and that thought it was a good idea to throw a 2 on the end of a game that was originally released 7 years before in the arcades. But just for a second, let's assume that I did actually care what other people thought, and I wanted to try to address that issue of relatability. How would I go about that for a game that's literally named for a job that didn't exist since even before the game was originally created? And yes, I would argue that Paperboys in most locations didn't exist by the time 1992 rolled around. I know specifically where I grew up that newspapers were delivered by guys in pickup trucks, not kids on bicycles that probably should have been concentrating on school rather than trying to figure out how to make that weird guy at the end of the street pay for their subscription. Yeah, I'm going to have to think about this one for a second. In the meantime, though, I should probably pause because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and just got randomly dropped here by the algorithm due to searching for... Yeah, I've done this gag for a while now, but I'm not real sure what you would have had to have been searching for to get dumped here this week. So maybe you were actually really searching for a Paperboy 2 review. You poor schmuck. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I'm out to collect and review not just video games that featured the withered husk of Atari attempting to feast on the long, rotten corpse of its former arcade division, but also the nearly 1,280 other titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis, either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Now, apologies for that previous slightly gross analogy if you just had lunch. I probably should have put up some sort of content warning or something, but you know, I don't really think that I'm that far off base. You know what, maybe that's how I make this video relatable to contemporary viewers. Paperboys in 2024 are fictional creatures, just like zombies. People still play zombie games, right? I mean, look at Dead Island 2. It's been wildly successful. Okay, maybe that's not the best example, but still. Even if the overall concept behind Paperboy 2 is as dead as the general population of Willamette Mall, at one time Tengen did think this sequel was a good idea. And due to that, and a licensing deal with Mindscape, Paperboy 2 ended up having a pretty widespread release between 1991 and 1993, appearing not just for home computers like the Amstrad CPC, ZX Spectrum, Amiga, and DOS, but also with versions appearing on the NES, Super NES, Game Boy, Game Gear, and of course the Genesis version that we're looking at today. But not the Commodore 64 for some reason. Figure that one out. Anyway, does this sequel improve upon the original at all and possibly bring something new to the table? Or is this just a total money grab, a game that really serves no purpose? Well, we shall see, but first, a look at the package.
And this is my copy of Paperboy 2 for the Genesis. I'm a bit worried about this game before I even get to the full review section, just because of how nice a shape this copy is in. And that might sound a little strange at first, but I'll explain. First though, this copy does look very minty, with really the only issue being the hang tab has been removed from the top. But at least it's a clean cut. As far as the rest of the package goes, there's no scratching or tearing to the outer cover, and the inner cover looks perfect with no sun or water damage. We'll get to the inside in a bit, but that portion looks fantastic as well, which leads into my conundrum. Is this game in great shape just simply because it's been well taken care of over the years, or is it in good shape because it's an absolute craptastic game and the previous owner played it once and never again after they found out? In the game's defense though, complete copies like this are currently going for about $30 on price charting, and if it was truly that terrible, I would expect it to see selling for probably half that. So perhaps this is just a well-maintained copy and nothing else. As far as the front cover goes, gone is the cartoonish main character from the original game, and instead we've got a photo cover of a kid loaded down with newspapers, catching air on a bike that probably shouldn't be being used to catch air, if we're going to be honest. I feel sorry for that guy's, well, how do I put this cleanly? Oh, here it is. His perineum is going to be busted up pretty good there, but at least it's a cool looking shot. At the top, there's the traditional Paperboy logo, just with a 2 spray painted at the end, and I think that's pretty appropriate considering. All in all, it's a solid cover, and apparently Domark agreed because more or less the same cover was used in Europe for the Mega Drive version, and as far as I can tell, at least a variation of this artwork was used on every version of the game that was released. Also, as was pretty common for Tengen releases, there was no Japanese version to speak of, so that's why I didn't mention it. Flipping over the back, and immediately you're hit with the tagline, Paperboy 2, twice the fun, double the excitement. Not bad, but also a pretty common refrain from advertisers that are trying to hype up a sequel, especially one with a number 2 in the title. It's always got to be twice as good as the original, or something like that. The formatting is in pretty standard Tengen formatting with a white background and then 2 screenshots at the top and bottom separated by some copy hyping up the game. The screenshots are of good quality, certainly better than I've seen in a few weeks, and they show what appear to be an interesting addition to the game with the street angled the other way. I'm definitely curious to see how that plays out. The flavor text in the middle does a good job of hyping up the game and does explain one of the things about the game is that now you have houses on both sides of the street to deliver to, but the rest really just seems like additions to the existing Paperboy formula. Opening up the package, and we've got a reply card and manual that are both in near perfect condition, but unfortunately it looks like the label is coming a little bit loose on the cartridge. As far as the manual goes, it's not very long, only consisting of 6 pages. Which again, pretty common for a Tengen release. Being that this is pretty much just Paperboy all over again with some new features, there's not really a ton that needs to be explained, but the manual does cover pretty much everything you would need to know about playing the game, so that's nice. But this is not one of those releases where the manual is really needed to know what's going on. Okay, that's the package. Let's get on the bike and hopefully keep our perineum intact. If you're not familiar with the original Paperboy going into this review, it actually would be somewhat understandable in 2024, as it is an almost 40-year-old arcade game at this point, with the original arcade game being one of the later hits for Atari, being released to the arcades in 1985. I myself have only played the actual arcade version of the title once, as 1985 was a few years before I would start to go to the arcades on a regular basis, and by the time I was actually starting to spend meaningful time in the arcades, Paperboy's time had already passed, and either had been phased out of most arcades, or just simply wasn't my focus because I was into things like beat-em-ups and shooters. However, I do remember when I played the arcade version of the game, because it was when I was an adult, and I must say, I thought the unique handlebar controls was a stroke of genius, because it took what was a relatively simple game and added a tactile experience that most other arcade games weren't providing with just a basic joystick and maybe a button or 2. Unfortunately, no one was going to make some crazy handlebar controllers for playing a home version of the game, so all the home ports of Paperboy, no matter how good or accurate, were always going to lose something by not having that interactive control scheme. Modern consoles, I'm sure, could approximate some of the movement controls to at least somewhat replicate those same motions, but in the early 90s, that sort of technology was nothing more than science fiction for the most part. That means that when you were playing something like the Genesis port of Paperboy, not only were you getting a lower resolution take on the arcade game, as the arcade cabinet utilized a medium resolution monitor, you were also effectively getting a dumbed down version of the game made to run on a control pad, and for a game that was already 7 years old at that point, this just wasn't an appetizing scenario for most, and now that definitely contributed to my only giving the Genesis version of the game only 2 stars back in episode 136. But this review isn't for Paperboy, it's for Paperboy 2. So what exactly is Paperboy 2? Well, the short version is that the original Paperboy had sold well when it was ported to home consoles, and managed to keep the popularity of the name Paperboy alive. This made Paperboy potentially into a franchisable title. However, by 1991, Tengen and Nintendo weren't exactly seeing eye to eye about anything, and Tengen wasn't in a position to make games any longer for the big N. So what was Tengen to do that still allowed them to sell games based on their intellectual property? Well, license that IP out to a company that was on good terms with Nintendo, and in this case, that happened to be Mindscape, who just so happened to be the same company that Tengen licensed Paperboy to originally be made on the NES. Now, to be clear, I'm not sure if there was some weirdness here where Mindscape still had the license to Paperboy and went rogue when creating Paperboy 2 on their own without any input from Tengen, or if they did just license it a second time. But either way, Paperboy 2 originally was not a Tengen product. The fact that Paperboy 2 isn't originally a Tengen title explains two things. One, why the Genesis version of Paperboy 2 looks a bit different than the various Mindscape versions of the game, and two, why the Genesis version came out much later than those versions. With Tengen just releasing the original Paperboy for the Genesis in February of 1992, they certainly weren't going to cannibalize sales of that title by rushing their port of the sequel to the market. I almost wonder why they released the original version of Paperboy on the Genesis at all, given that time period, but I'm sure that the simple reason was just money. Regardless of where the original idea for Paperboy 2 ended up coming from, the question remained of what the developers were going to do for a sequel. If you're familiar with video games at all, you know that traditionally sequels go one of two ways. Either they're basically a spruced up version of the original game, just trotted back out with a number at the end of the title, or they might be something drastically different that only shares a name and maybe a loose plot with that original title. I've definitely run into both scenarios so far when doing the channel, with probably the worst version of that being Jeopardy! And Jeopardy! Deluxe Edition for the Genesis that I reviewed in episodes 34 and 133, which ended up being the exact same game, just with different questions. Now, that might be an extreme example, but having a sequel that was a bit too similar to the original was definitely in play and a concern for me when I picked up Paperboy 2. As mentioned, the original Paperboy being an arcade game from 1985, it's a pretty simple game, as that was just the nature of arcade games at the time. But the entire time that I played Paperboy, whether it was for the Genesis or the Master System, I couldn't help it feeling like it needed more. There's a line from Muppets Take Manhattan that always stuck with me, where after Kermit the Frog recovers from amnesia, and they're trying to figure out how to fix the big show, and Kermit says, "That's what we need, more frogs and dogs and bears and chickens and whatevers." And what he really meant there was simply that the show needed to be bigger to succeed. Now, I don't know if the designers of Paperboy 2 were fans of the Muppets, but the concept of making the game bigger was definitely followed. One of the things that makes the original game feel so simple is that you're essentially doing the exact same thing on the same path 7 times in a row, if you just happen to be good enough to survive that long. As of course the game gets more difficult the more days you get into your paper route. Even when you choose to ride on one of the more difficult routes, the entire game consists of you riding your bike down the street on a diagonal path and servicing subscribers on your left side, and then maybe also terrorizing some non-subscribers, all while trying to avoid obstacles, either in people's yards, on the sidewalk directly, or on the street. Again, for an arcade quarter muncher from 1985, it wasn't a bad concept, as it was a wholly original idea at the time, but by the time the 90s had rolled around, things had changed, and people were expecting more in-depth experiences, especially on home consoles, where kids could play for hours at a time, rather than just for a few minutes on a quarter or two before moving on to something else. For Paperboy 2, as shown on the rear cover, not only do you now have houses on your left side, but also your right. Crazy concept, right? To start out with, when going down Easy Street, the easiest route available, your route has a bend in the middle, so at first your houses are on the left, and then halfway down it shifts to the right. Now, granted, you're really just doing the same things as the previous game by trying to avoid obstacles and enemies. and throwing papers to your side, but just the fact that you now have to get your brain used to throwing to the right and left open things up more than you might expect. And things expand from there as well, with medium way and hard road having multiple bends to keep the route interesting. Also, these bends shouldn't necessarily be thought of as just turns. Each one has a purely vertical section that can be as simple as having a gas station and a market on either side, or perhaps a full-fledged carnival that you have to navigate through before getting back to the familiarity of your suburban houses. I really enjoy how these connecting sections break up the action, and while sure the gameplay remains fairly simple, the fact that you're now having to really concentrate on whether you go to the right or the left, as opposed to just previously going straight the entire time, makes the game world feel much more alive. The world isn't fully fleshed out, as you will still pass by the same types of houses multiple times during your route, no matter which difficulty you pick, but at least having these variations help keep the monotony down. From a gameplay perspective, if you're familiar with the original Paperboy, you're certainly going to be able to pick up and play this game right away. Throwing to the left and right with the A or B buttons, respectively, feels very natural, and the rest of the bike movement is in line with the original game. You can also now jump as well without having to hit a ramp by hitting the C button, and while you probably won't be doing that too often, it is helpful for getting back onto the sidewalk if you have enough momentum. Just like in the first game, Paperboy 2 is deceptively difficult, which comes with the nature of having a relatively simple control scheme. But I don't think I would describe it as being too difficult, or unfairly hard. Sure, every now and then there's going to be some enemies that pop up when you have almost no time to react, but the game also remains fairly static, so for those sequences, you could probably memorize what's going to occur and what might be the best way to react the next time you attempt that particular day of the week. Most of the time when I died during the game, it was because I was either being careless or I didn't give myself enough room on the path. And in that regard, the hitboxes are not forgiving, so there's not going to be any room for sloppy play. But again, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, and actually, it makes things a bit addicting, because you end up in that mindset of, well, let me just play one more time. I bet I can get further this time. From a graphics perspective, Paperboy 2 shares the same look of the first game, but is slightly improved in areas. I think in general the animation in Paperboy 2, whether it's your character or the world itself, has been improved. Also, now Paperboy 2 takes up the entire screen, as opposed to the original Paperboy on the Genesis having the top of the screen dedicated to just scorekeeping, which is nice, not just because it looks better, but because also now you're able to see more of the screen, which means you'll have that much more advanced notice of what's coming for you next. As mentioned, when you compare the Genesis version to pretty much any other version of the game, it's going to have a slightly different look, as it did come from Tengen instead of Mindscape. But honestly, I think the Genesis is the best looking out of the bunch, because while there are some graphical elements, specifically with the houses, that the Genesis version doesn't have, there's also a few things that were added, and I think for the better. Sound-wise, the Genesis version of Paperboy 2 is the best of the bunch as well. I'm not exactly sure what was going on with the Super Nintendo version, but it's got a fairly strident sounding soundtrack that is just hard to enjoy. The Genesis version, on the other hand, while being somewhat limited in the amount of background music that you'll hear during the game, at least all sounds good, and is nice and jaunty and serves to actually be in the background and not distracting. The Genesis version also has the best sound effects, and again, while there's not a ton of them, they accent the game well. And the Genesis version retains Paperboy's digital speech from the original game, where he would occasionally quip based on what was going on at the time. Listening to the other versions of the game and not hearing that speech just sounds odd. Also, with the new options of being able to play as either Paperboy or Paper Girl, both main characters have their speech samples at different rates, giving the Paper Girl a higher sounding voice in what I thought was a nice touch. Going into Paperboy 2, I'll admit I did not have very high hopes for the title. I'm not exactly a huge fan of the original game, as I kind of think that it's fine for what it is, and I'm just not going to have a large desire to play a simple arcade game from 40 years ago that often. The fact that Paperboy 2 isn't an arcade port alone definitely gave me the feeling that perhaps the effort here might not be up to snuff, and instead just a quick and dirty money grab. But thankfully, Paperboy 2 for the Genesis does exceed the original title in every way, expanding things to be slightly more fitting of the era that it was released in. However, if I'm being honest, even though the Genesis version is the best version of the game, and it is improved from the first game, it still doesn't make it a groundbreaking title, especially for early 1993. As a result, I'm giving Paperboy 2 for the Genesis 2 stars. While it's not the most amazing game in the world, if you're a fan of Paperboy, you should definitely give this a look, as you'll probably be pleasantly surprised.
Okay, and that's Paperboy 2 for the Genesis. I'll readily admit that I like this game way more than I was expecting. When I went to record game footage of the game, I recorded probably twice as much as I'd originally planned, and certainly way more than I really needed for the video, simply because I was enjoying myself. And in fact, I would even go so far as to say that this is the definitive Paperboy title of the era, and if you have a copy of this, you really don't need a copy of the original Paperboy, as there's nothing in that game that isn't done better here. From a purely fun perspective, Paperboy 2 is a lot better than most games that I've given 2 stars to on the channel, and if I gave out half stars, this would be the one that would be at that 2.5 star level, to set it apart a bit, even with its technical limitations. Now, next time on Zilog and Moto, well, so far this year, we've reviewed 6 Genesis games, 2 Master System games, and even a 32X game, but no Sega CD games. Well, that changes this week, as I actually already had a Sega CD game added to the schedule. I didn't have to manipulate anything, it was just there when I went to go check if I had anything written down for the next episode. It's nice when these things just work out like that, isn't it? Anyway, as far as the game goes, it's a port of a game that I've actually already reviewed, but that was a great title on its own that spawned a series that millions of people are still playing to this day, so I'm okay with kicking this one around again, especially since I think it's got some things that the Genesis version doesn't. So I'll be curious to see what those are, and maybe you'll learn something as well. Well, that is it for Zilog and Moto episode 232. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help other people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later!